So much. Well, I wish I could be with you in California, but I guess this is the next best thing. After 30 some odd years and 12 novels with an observant wife, I've finally written my first sequel. What was there about the characters of Leah, Yaakov, Shandela, and Fruma Esther from an Orthodox match, the novel which preceded it, that I just could not let go? To really explore this idea properly, I have to go back to the novel that preceded these two, Devil in Jerusalem, a book snatched from the headlines about a shockingly depraved crime that could only have happened in Jerusalem. Based on a harrowing true story, the book describes the insidious infiltration of a family of innocent religious American olim by a so-called Kabbalist in Jerusalem who seduces the wife, exiles the husband, and tortures the children, inflicting irreversible brain damage on the youngest, who is a fearless 3-year-old and the only one who, in his heartbreaking innocence, wasn't afraid to speak his mind. After immersing myself into this story to understand the widespread mystical Kabbalah cults rampant among Jerusalem's religious communities, I began to understand both the vulnerability of the new immigrants seeking holiness in the holiest of cities, as well as the motivation and the behavior of this sickening cult of child abusers. This wasn't easy, to say the least. In fact, trying to delve into the mind of a psychopathic child abuser pretending to be a holy Jew was like diving into a particularly revolting and repulsive hell. But understanding how vital it was to alert the public to these issues, I felt a compelling obligation to write this story in all its horror. Well, when I completed this book, I thought I deserved some kind of medal. Unfortunately, no medals are available for battles in the dark writers face between themselves and their computer. So instead, I thought I'd reward myself by choosing a topic for my next book, which would transport me to a lovely, kind place. And what could be more adorable and gentle to a writer's psyche than tackling a love story? At that time, I had come across a newspaper article written by a woman who had become famous in Israel several years previously for publishing a book describing her transition from a glamorous TV personality to a religious wife and mother in an ultra-Orthodox Jerusalem neighborhood. And here she was now, some 10 years and many children later, lamenting how badly she and her family had been treated by their religious neighbors, who had never accepted them because of their unforgivable crime of once having been secular Jews. In my own mind, these two things clicked. Adorable love story about a girl who gives up her successful secular life to find new meaning in love among ultra-Orthodox Jews. I saw Lola Leah as one of the many women I had met on book tours all over the country and the world, 30-something, single, longing to get married and to start a family, almost in despair over finding a serious partner. Such feelings were epidemic among the young Jewish women I met, as was worry for their future among their parents. I myself actually have a 34-year-old unmarried son, so it's a subject that's very close to my heart. All these ideas were floating around in my head, but in order to write a novel, you really need more than a handful of ideas and newspaper clippings. What you really must have is a fundamental understanding of your characters. As my dear friend and former New York Times editor Christopher Phillips once told me, you have to know what they eat for breakfast and what toothpaste they use. I was certainly not there yet with Leah. There were so many unanswered questions. Why leave a perfectly secular life, a good secular life, for the restrictions of orthodoxy? What was the best part and the hardest of going from a secular to an Orthodox lifestyle? And how did the Orthodox community treat you once you made your choice and moved in? With the tool of the internet and the magic of Facebook, however, I was soon able to gather together a group of volunteers, all of whom had embraced a religious lifestyle in their 30s as single women. These women very generously agreed to answer these questions and many more. And from their responses, I distilled a fascinating profile of not only what Leah ate for breakfast, rabbinically approved low-fat granola, by the way, but what she dreamt of and what were her greatest fears. The love story itself came to me from nowhere. The character of Yaakov simply landing on my mental doorstep like a delivery from a literary fairy godmother. I imagined a young widower, a fervent Talmud scholar, trying and failing to cope with the reality of single parenthood after a lifetime of being coddled and tended by all of the women in his family, so as to leave him free to pursue his sacred studies. The divinely ordained collision of these two lives comprised an unorthodox match. But when I got to the inevitable place in the novel where I needed to take leave of my creations, sending them off like a kind parent to live their lives out in the imagination of my readers, something very strange and unprecedented happened to me. I realized that for the very first time in my life as a writer, I just couldn't bear to part from them. Not yet, at least. I had so much more I wanted to explore as I envisioned their future together. Unlike writers of fairy tales, I couldn't rely on happily ever after, not with a modern woman, however in love, and a man deeply committed to an ancient rules and laws, some of which were medieval when it came to women's place in the world. When I looked ahead at what I knew was in store for them, it made me tremble. For example, how was Leah going to cope with the rhythm of Orthodox married life, with its 2 weeks of abstinence and separation each month and the required attendance at the ritual baths? This is something every Orthodox woman struggles with, believe it or not, certainly at the beginning. How is a savvy, knowledgeable, experienced woman like Leah going to cope when her husband couldn't touch her almost half the time they were together? And was it going to work out for Yaakov, who had only ever known one other woman, an innocent 18-year-old bride? How would he cope with the insecurities and change in his sexual life with a woman of the world? Something equally challenging was how Yaakov would cope with being exiled from his beloved yeshiva when he was forced by necessity out into the working world, a transition which mirror imaged that of Leah's from secular to religious, and was no less fraught with trauma and insecurity. I had no idea. These were certainly situations I couldn't relate to from my own personal experience. When I began to research the feelings of the yeshiva boy who leaves the yeshiva after many years, I imagined it would be a fairly obscure topic. But to my complete surprise, I found a plethora of articles written by former full-time yeshiva students describing their feelings. I even came across an entire book written by the head of a yeshiva who, instead of trying to talk Talmud scholars out of leaving full-time learning, actually encouraged them to get on with their lives and consoled them that working for a living was also God's will. Wow, so apparently leaving the yeshiva and getting a job was a new trend among religious Jews. I'd had no idea. And then, of course, there was that naughty little rambunctious baby called Shandela, who we parted from, dripping with shame and fury of having her father marry a newly observant Jew. How did she deal with the wedding? And where was she headed? I could imagine many scenarios for her, none of them with happy endings. I felt, as an author, I needed to accompany her through the next stage and watch over her carefully. It was almost the same as I feel about my granddaughters, who are about the same age. Being an author, creating characters is not that different from being a grandmother. There is really nothing much you can do if characters are determined to make all the wrong choices. I simply cannot put my thumb on the scale to create an unrealistic happy end when the characters refuse to cooperate. All I could do is watch her live her life, sitting in the wings, wringing my hands. I, no less than my readers, was curious to know the outcome of her story. Last but certainly not least, I wanted to see how Bubba Frumma Esther was doing. Of all the characters, I'm probably closest in age to her, and perhaps we see the world from a similar perspective. I was interested in seeing through her eyes how the family and community was faring and what clever things she would come up with to make their lives holier and better. Of all the characters, she is the most communally minded, a leader in her own way. She is also the female equivalent of Rav Alter, And then I thought there was certainly going to be romance in the life of 17-year-old Chandler. Why not also in Fuma Esther's life? She is, after all, single, so she isn't young. Do you have to be young to need companionship and affection? Isn't it written, it is not good for man, read that woman, to be alone? God didn't qualify that with age restrictions. Why should I? And as I ended writing in Unorthodox Max, I just couldn't see abandoning my characters at their engagement party. Why, my goodness, all the best scenes were still to come. The wedding, the first night, Yaakov's first day at work, Chandler's first boyfriend, Leah's run-in with her neighbors. It was like leaving your newborn baby on a stranger's doorstep and hoping for the best. I just couldn't. So I picked up the baby and I took it home to bring it up myself. The question is, why? What was so different, so special about these characters that didn't hold true for Sheva Halevi and Jephthah's daughter, and Dina Reich and Sota and Tamar Feingold in The Sacrifice of Tamar? Did I love these characters any less? Was I any less concerned about their happiness and their future? Of course not. After much soul searching, I finally realized that the real answer lies in the parallels between my own life and that of Leah Howard's, which is not true to the same extent of my other characters. I too was born to a secular family and brought up single-handedly by my mother, Ada Fogel-Terlinsky, Aleha Hashalom, who was left with 3 small children to raise when my father, her beloved husband, Louis, died suddenly in the prime of life. She didn't collapse, and she didn't turn bitterly to God with complaints. She found a job, and she tried to see to it that all her children had good religious educations. Most of all, she provided her children with a wonderful personal example of how a good human being and a good Jew should behave. I've always admired that so much. How she succeeded in going back to work as a secretary of the Board of Education and kept climbing the ladder by passing one after another civil service exam until she reached the very top in her field. She worked so hard, but through it all, she had a wonderful sense of humor. Whatever troubles we had, and believe me, we had them. I remember there was hardly a day that went by where there wasn't some laughter as well. I remember how she encouraged each of us to be creative. My brother Jay, the entrepreneur, my brother David, the craftsman, and me, the writer. I remember exactly where it was I decided to write. It was a cold winter's night. Daddy had died in February, and spring really seemed so far away that year. I remember lying in the dark in my cold, narrow bed, and I calling out to her, "I can't sleep," I said. "I have nothing to think about." And she called back, "Think about something nice. Think about the country, about cows and chickens and grass." Now, growing up in a New York City housing project where the minuscule patches of grass were all chained off and the only cows and chickens to be found were wrapped in clear plastic in the supermarket, I called back, "I can't, I'm cold." And then she came to me and covered me with her old fur coat, one of those extravagant gifts my father had given her during the early days of their marriage. And then she lay down beside me, her arms around me, and she whispered, "Do you want me to read to you?" Now, I don't know if I really did, but I wanted her to stay. So I must have said yes. And then she took out a copy of David Copperfield. I don't know why. Why did she choose this particular story? But now, years later, I can only imagine the shock of recognition in my 6-year-old soul when she read, "I was a posthumous child. My father's eyes had closed upon the light of this world 6 months when mine opened on it, and there is something strange in the shadowy remembrance of his white gravestone and the indefinable compassion I suddenly felt for it lying out alone there in the dark night when our little parlor was warm and bright with fire and candle, and the doors of our house were almost cruelly, it seemed to me, sometimes, bolted and locked against it." The story of a little boy suddenly orphaned of father, and later, most nightmarish of worries, his mother as well, the injustices, the kindness of strangers, the sadness and the triumph, was a revelation to me. I was not alone. Others, children not unlike myself, had gone through the same tragedies and triumphed. I remember growing drowsy and warm. I remember finally being able to go to sleep. But before I did, I remember turning to my mother and whispering, "I'm going to write my own book one day, and I'm going to call it Chains Around the Grass." My mother was nothing like my character, Cheryl Howard, a rebel and an atheist. While not Sabbath observant, she believed in God and lit candles every Friday night using the 100-year-old pewter candlesticks bequeathed to her by her own mother, who she also lost at an age similar to mine when I lost my father. Like my character, Leah Howard, I too eventually found my way to God and to Orthodoxy after finding secular American life and its possibilities wanting. And however much I came to love and respect an Orthodox lifestyle and bring my children up that way, I too found myself on a collision course with the hidden evils in that world because I, like Leah, refused to accept that such things could be part of the sacred life I had been taught to seek, to live, and to respect. All these things deserved a book of their own. Until my first sequel was born, An Observant Wife takes the love story of Yaakov and Leah from the passionate beginnings to the far more complex and profound relationship they share as husband and wife. Certain things certainly surprised me as the story unfolded. Yes, an author can be shocked at what characters decide to say and do. As Tolstoy once wrote, to my utter shock, Vronsky took out a gun and tried to kill himself. But I think the character that surprised me most of all was Shandela, as she transitions into young womanhood, undergoing a shocking experience that tears the whole family and the entire community apart. I certainly did not see that coming. The writing of An Observant Wife felt to me as if I was finally summing up decades of thinking and writing about the ultra-Orthodox world. In writing about Leah and her future, I was basically examining my own life. Today, when the doors and windows of the once exotic and mysterious religious world have been flung open and tourists are traipsing through with their cameras through dramas like Netflix Unorthodox and schlocky reality shows like My Unorthodox Life, documentaries like A World Apart, and movie after movie which leaves no stone unturned in exploring every dark corner of Haredi life, homosexuality, lesbianism, wife abuse, child abuse, I have some mixed feelings. It was, after all, my book, Jephthah's Daughter, that really battened down those iron gates and pulled up the shades covering the windows. I did this not just by writing about the Haredi world, but by showing that there was a widespread audience for such literature. By writing a bestseller that took place in that world, my books garnered the commercial interest of publishing houses and dramatists, revealing that the ultra-Orthodox world was a culturally rich and diverse society worthy of literary interest and creation. I'm very proud of the part my books have played in convincing cultural arbiters that this world, this society, is no less fascinating than the world of Japanese geishas or Mormon fundamentalists, that it deserves the interest of serious literary creation. This has not been without controversy. Some years ago, people were bombarding me with emails about an article published in the New York Times written by Wendy Shalit, who I understood also became an Orthodox Jew at a certain point, and she wrote an article about novels that depict the ultra-Orthodox. This was back in 2005, long before the avalanche of Haredi-based stories. And most people wanted me to know that I had not been mentioned at all. I must say this surprised me. When I published my first novel, Jephthah's Daughter, by Warner Books in 1989, about an ultra-Orthodox girl forced into an arranged marriage, I was credited by some and accused by others of creating the genre. I followed it with two other books, Sota and the Sacrifice of Tamar, which was published by Crown Books in 1992 and 1994, both of which take place in the ultra-Orthodox world. In addition, my play, Women's Minyan, which ran many years at Israel's National Theater, was based on a true story about an ultra-Orthodox mother of 12. I think my omission from this 2005 article was no oversight. Unlike Nathan Englander's and Tova Mirvitz's credentials, which Miss Shalit deemed unworthy of granting them true entree into the closed circle she defended, my own are rather less easy to dismiss. In addition to a BA and an MA in English from Brooklyn College and Hebrew University, they include 12 years at an Orthodox day school and a year at Sarah Schneer's Hebrew Teacher Seminary in Borough Park. In addition, I have lived over 50 years in Jerusalem. most of them in or around ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods. My books, which were all huge bestsellers in Israel when they were translated into Hebrew, have long been read by the members of the community they depict, those who are in the best position to judge whether they're fair and accurate. The feedback has been enormous and continuing. When I finally did get around to reading what Miss Shalit had to say, I had a number of reactions. First, I shared her discomfort and her sense of anger with authors who know nothing or very little about the inner workings of the world they pretend to depict, what she deems the outsider insider. I personally cringed at movies like Price Above Rubies, which she doesn't mention, in which a rabbi's wife is propositioned and raped by her brother-in-law and finds joy by eating pork and sleeping with a Puerto Rican. However, Miss Shalit's basic premise that people write negative things about the ultra-Orthodox world because they simply don't know any better has been proven astoundingly untrue by an ever-growing slew of books written by insiders like Leah Vincent's Cut Me Loose, Shalom Oslander's Foreskins Lamed, and Deborah Feldman's Unorthodox, upon which the Netflix hit is based, all of whom have embraced what I like to call the disgruntled insider's role with a vengeance. I have met many Wendy Shalitz over the years, newly Orthodox Jews from the secular world that have embraced Orthodoxy or what they have been taught as Orthodoxy, with stars in their eyes and the fervor of the newly born again. In fact, Leah in my latest book is exactly like that at first. They use their secular education to fiercely defend their new world against all comers, particularly others from a similar background who beg to differ. I understand them, I really do. I went through the stage too. However, a wealth of experiences finally forced me, almost reluctantly I might add, as well as my character Leah, to face reality. When the saintly ultra-Orthodox rabbi to whom I was paying room and board in Borough Park, and whom I deeply admired, he's one of my teachers, asked me to type up an entire manuscript for free, and then kicked me out when I said I didn't have the time, it was an eye-opener. And when my ultra-Orthodox neighbor in Jerusalem asked me to help her get a passport because her ultra-Orthodox husband was beating her, and she wanted to go home to Williamsburg, I was shocked. And when my neighbor, the wife of a highly respected Talmud scholar, jumped out of the 22nd floor of the Tel Aviv Sheraton, clutching her 3-year-old daughter because her husband was sexually and physically abusing both her and her child, I wrote a book, my very first, about the ultra-Orthodox world. I called that book Jephthah's Daughter. And I was told it hit the Jewish world like a bomb. It wasn't at all the reaction I'd wanted or expected. In fact, I'd convinced myself that the community would not only join me in my outrage, but honor my effort to expose and correct societal ills. After all, wasn't that what our religion was all about? What played out instead was disappointingly cliché. Despite the pieties I'd been brought up to trust, I was treated like a whistleblower, particularly by people like Miss Shalit. Some, like the bewigged matron of a New Jersey lecture, actually stood up and called me a liar in front of 400 people. But mostly, I was told I had violated the unspoken code, which says that in our world, we don't wash dirty laundry in public. Well, if you don't wash dirty laundry, it really starts to stink, a rabbi once told me. I was deeply hurt, and I wondered what to do next. And in my almost unbelievable naivete, I imagined that the solution would be to write another book about the Haredim, a less harsh and judgmental one. Sota was that book. It's a book in which ultra-Orthodox men are supportive husbands and wonderful human beings. There, I said to myself, you've made up for the Talmud scholar's wife-beater in Jephthah's Daughter. My complete misreading of the situation was revealed to me in short order. Rather than smoking a peace pipe, the people who hated Jephthah's Daughter were twice as angry about this book than they had ever been about the first one. The magazine The Jewish Observer, the house organ of the ultra-Orthodox, the Agudat Yisrael party, publicly accused me of making money from savaging the community. That at a public lecture advertised in the Jewish press, held in the heart of Borough Park, and at which I fully expected to be tarred and feathered, I finally understood what was really going on. As I stood before an audience of rabbis, Talmud students, religious women and girls, wondering what on earth was going to happen, a carefully wigged, modestly dressed woman stood up. "I'm a rabbi's wife," she said, "and I'd just like to thank you for saying all the things I could never say." Well, the audience gave me a standing ovation. It was then that it dawned on me my critics were really a minority. But for them, it really didn't matter what I wrote. My betrayal was the very act of depicting the religious world in a traditional fiction. It was in the act of freely exploring and commenting on what I saw around me in a world where publishing houses like Targum Press, for whom I worked briefly as an editor, and ArtScroll and Feldheim routinely publish novels where everyone is either a saint or a villain, and all religious Jews have no vices. It was in my attempt to show complexity and shades of gray that I had betrayed them, and more in the act of creating for myself, a woman, a pulpit in which to express her criticism of the world around her. After all, we don't have a bima, only the rabbi has a bima. Armed with this knowledge, the heavy burden of guilt and remorse lifted from my shoulders, I chose to write The Sacrifice of Tamar. Ironically, at that Borough Park lecture hall where a young woman approached me, offering to share her own horrific tale of rape by a stranger as she babysat for her sister's children, and I used that information in the book. I learned so much from her and from her husband and the dynamics of love, of mourning and forgiveness that goes down between a Haredi married couple faced with such a criminal assault. It was that group, the ones who rose to their feet to applaud my efforts to make life better for them and their children by exposing all the hidden pain and corruption that had hitherto been taboo to talk about, that gave me strength to write The Sacrifice of Tamar and to later go back to that world and that community to write other books. I admit I did flee for a time to calmer pastures, choking as I was beneath the black cloud of condemnation from a fanatical minority who continue to view me as the enemy. I chose at that point to graze in literary fields that were not so heavily mined, writing and publishing 3 other novels about Sephardic Jewry, American modern Orthodox Jews, and a terror attack in Israel. Eventually, filled with insights I didn't have at the beginning of my writing career, and realizing I had a great deal more to say, I realized that I needed to go back to the world in which my writing career had begun. I did this because as a writer, I found that I had a good deal more to say, and that I had never really delved deeply enough into my own experience, the world of the newly Orthodox trying to make a life in the traditional neighborhoods which so attract the secular, radiating as they do the aura of holiness and mystery. What do those streets truly contain? Is there a valuable secret known only to the initiated, or is it smoke and mirrors? Now, after so many years living among Haredim and writing about them, I think I found the answers, which form the basis for my latest book, An Observant Wife. It isn't a simple answer, because it isn't a simple question. I have met many sinners in my travels among the ultra-Orthodox, people who are not only hypocrites, but whose cowardly cover-up of the evil they perpetrate is truly a desecration of God's name. This calls to mind the defense of the Australian pedophile Malka Leifer, who was sheltered from facing extradition and the consequences of her despicable crimes against the religious young women who she had violated by none other than Israel's very ultra-Orthodox Minister of Health, Yaakov Leitzman, a Ger Chassid, who refused to extradite her. It includes Haredi community leaders like Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, who encouraged whole communities to ignore coronavirus health regulations, leading to outbreaks among the ultra-Orthodox where thousands were infected and hundreds died. I have also met and been inspired by rabbinical leaders. The very opposite, the other side of the coin. People who are fearlessly forging new paths in serving God, who are not afraid to denounce what is wrong and stand up despite fierce criticism for all that is precious and holy and good. Among them is who I consider my mentor, Rav Mark D'Angelo, the Rabbi Emeritus of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in Manhattan. Rabbi Benny Lau, who was founder of a worldwide Bible study initiative 929 and the former rabbi of the Ramban Synagogue in Jerusalem, in which I was for many years a member, and Rabbi Kalman Samuels, who founded Shalva, a unique institution that helps children with debilitating diseases and their families. I could give you many, many more names on both sides. Rabbi Noah Corman, who started the first shelter for abused religious women in the world, I think, but it's here in Jerusalem, and he did this 30 years ago. So what is Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Judaism? To describe it is like the proverbial committee of blind men sent to describe an elephant. All of us are molded in our beliefs by the part of that world that we have touched, and most importantly, the part that has touched us. I would be continuing to write about this world if I thought it was, I would not be continuing to write about this world if I thought it was hopelessly flawed and without any hope of redemption. Quite the opposite. I continue to write and explore because I am driven by a desire to be fair, to be inclusive, to leave no aspect untouched, no facet unexplored. I have lived my life according to the rules of the Torah that I learned as a child in the Orthodox Day School in Rockaway, the Hebrew Institute of Long Island. I was taught by mostly modern Orthodox rabbis and a few ultra-Orthodox ones, and I remember all of them with affection and respect and gratitude and honor. Looking back, it has been a hard life, but a good one. A life filled with meaningful days, holy days, days I cannot imagine being deprived of by a secular lifestyle. Do Orthodox Jews practice what they preach? Not always. Do they pretend to be holier than they are? Sometimes. But as for the majority, they are good, simple people, honestly endeavoring to be true to their heritage and their religious upbringing, to live decent, honest lives close to God's word. This innocence often makes them prime target for Ponzi schemes and bad leadership, leaving them prone to dangers and losses a more sophisticated population would surely be savvy enough to avoid. Does this make them any less praiseworthy? It's a question that is heartbreaking to consider, for we cannot blame children for being taken advantage of, and yet we cannot help but cry for them and wish them more knowledgeable. We cannot help but wish their educators and leaders would prepare them better for the real world. Looking back, knowing all I know, I have few regrets. My books and the new authors who have come along have reached into the heart of the society we write about, allowing for discussion and criticism, proving along the way that such things don't necessarily bring disastrous consequences. Quite the opposite. Since Jeff's daughter, I have been seen shelters built for abused religious Jewish women, rabbis' conferences on domestic abuse. I have seen the rise of Orthodox women's organizations like Kolech, which strive to better the treatment of women at the hands of rabbinical courts and in sexual harassment situations at work. I have seen a rich growth of fiction about the Orthodox world from new writers like Nathan Anglander and Tova Mervis and Risa Miller, all of whom I read with interest and admiration. As for Michelit's criticism, the truth is many in the ultra-Orthodox world and those who think they want to be part of it view literature much as Snow White's stepmother viewed the magic mirror. They don't want to see their face. They want to be told they are the fairest ones of all. I believe that except for cults like the Moonies, there is no legitimate society which should have a problem with fictional exploration. True, some authors might get the story wrong, just like early writers of Westerns fell into cliches about cowboys and Indians. But once a society is deemed worthy of fictional exploration, eventually the pendulum swings back. By making the lives of ultra-Orthodox characters the subject of fictional exploration, authors are mining a motherlode of rich and complex material. Even if some of it isn't perfectly realized, the experimentation can only, in the end, result, I think, to prove positive both for literature and for the religious world. In the end, an observant wife feels to me, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, like my last word on this subject, but I wouldn't swear to it. Often a story comes along that an author hasn't thought of, some new twist that's worthy of study, something that sheds a new light on everything that's come before. If that happens, I will not be afraid to jump headfirst back into those waters, but only if it's a new take, a new ocean, a new horizon. I refuse to tread water. My next book opens in an entirely new neighborhood, the world of the modern day descendants of survivors and Nazi hunters, and their counterparts, the children and grandchildren of the perpetrators, all of them born long after the atrocities were committed. What is the relationship to the evils of the past? What should our relationship be? What should their relationship be to each other? Inspired by an impossible true love story between these two polar opposites, I take on the unimaginable task of exploring justice and forgiveness in the context of the horror that was our fate as Jews a generation ago. Have we any right to forgive? More, can we, may we love? What obligations has the past bequeathed to us and our children? What moral imperatives? Are they the same for descendants of the perpetrators, or are they wholly different? What do both of us need to do to move forward in honesty and compassion without forgetting the sacred obligation of memory? And what factors make it impossible? Look for it next year. Sojourn with the Enemy. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here. And I hope that you'll write me when you've read my book and let me know what you think. If you would have done a different job with the sequel, I'd love to hear about that as well. So thanks a lot.
Okay.
And now, if you want to ask questions, I'd be happy to hear.
So I'd ask anybody to put questions in the chat, and then we'll read them for Naomi. So first we have Dana, who says, not a question, but a huge thank you for your intelligent, brave, and thought-provoking novels and giving your readers insight and the ability to evaluate and struggle with the dilemmas you write about. I have enjoyed reading your body of work and have learned a tremendous amount. Thank you, Dana.
Well, thank you so much. How kind. Thank you so much.
And here we have a question from Julie. How long does it take to write your books?
Well, that depends on the book. If you have to do extensive research, I did extensive research in one of my books. The Ghost of Hannah Mendez was about Sephardic Jewry, and I'm an Ashkenazi from both sides. I didn't know anything about Sephardic Jewry, and it was a historical novel. So I had to travel to Spain. I had to travel to Portugal. I had to read history books. I had to try to understand something about the historical era, and that took me 5 years before I even started to put a word down on paper. And then sometimes you have a book that is in your blood, and you sit down and it just comes rushing out. How do you write a book? Somebody once said, first you cut one of your veins and let the blood drip onto the paper. Not so bad. But there are books that have taken me a year to write. The average is about 1.5 years, but then the publishing house takes another year to publish it. So it's by the time you finish writing a book, it's another year before it will come out. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Anyone else have any question?
I actually have a follow-up question to that. It's thank you for a great presentation. The Observant Wife was my first of your books, and I am eager to go get the rest. So thank you. This might be a little bit of a crass question. I'm interested in the industry. I'm interested in different industries. It takes a year, and then you said with all that research, like, do you get paid a flat fee? Do you get paid per book? In 20 years, when someone buys one of your books, do you get another $1? Like, how does the industry work?
This is how it works. With my first book, when you're an unknown, you have to write your book not knowing if anybody's going to publish it. You have to invest in yourself, and then you hopefully get an agent, and then the agent sells the book, and you get a certain amount of money up front before the book is published. And if the amount you get is more than you deserve, you get to keep it. If the amount you get is less than you deserve and you sell more books than they paid you for, then they give you the rest of the money. Now, if you're an author who's well known and you have a relationship with a publishing house, which is what I have, and I have been working with St. Martin's Press for at least 25 years, and I have an editors there, and I have an agent, and usually what happens is I have an idea for a book, and I will give a few pages describing what I plan to write, and that goes to my editor to see if they want to buy the book, and they decide yes or no. I've never had a book turned down, so I don't know what it is when they say no. They always say yes to me, and then between your agent and the publishing house, there's a negotiation for how much money you're going to get up front, and then you write the book. So no, you do not have to wait until the book is finished and it goes out and people pay for it. The publishing house taking a risk, because if they give you more money than they earn back, then they lose. But usually what happens is they give you so little on every book that they sell, you only get, I don't know, 7% or 10% on every book they sell, and the 90% that they get for the book goes to them. So it's very rare that even if, you don't earn out your advance, as it says, very seldom that the publishing house is going to lose money, because they've made an enormous amount of money on every single book that they've sold. So they get their 90% from each book that they sell. And most of the time, unless it's an unusual situation, you don't sell any books at all, which could happen, I guess. Never happened to me, but I guess it's possible that the publishing house can lose a lot of money if they gave an advance, which is not paid for by sale of books. And now you can go out and write a book, and you can try to do this, and I wish you luck.
No, not me. Thank
Now
you.
you know everything that I know.
I'm a reader, not a writer, but thanks.
Dana's asking, what are you writing now? I think you had begun to touch on that. What
Yes,
book are you writing?
I'm writing a book, as I spoke about a romance, which is a true story, an unlikely true story, between a Nazi hunter and the child of perpetrators. And they meet and they fall in love. And this unlikely story is what I'm writing now. And I have no idea how it's going to work out. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how the real story is going to be involved in my fictional story. As I said, I'm writing it now, and I need another year to answer that question completely.
Wendy's asking, would you be interested in seeing any of your books made into a movie or TV series? Which one would it be?
I would love it. Please send them in my direction.
Okay, Shar is asking, what surprises you most when you get to the end of your books? Does anything surprise you the most?
Well, let me see, a book that surprised me. There was a book that didn't surprise me, but it actually broke my heart. And that was The Covenant. And that was a story of a terrorist attack in Israel and the kidnapping of a doctor. And it was also based on a true story. And I so much wanted him to survive. I so much wanted things to end well. I so much wanted the rescue attempt of the Israeli army to work out. And I was surprised at what happened at the end, because it wasn't something that as a human being that I wanted, but as an author, I really couldn't do anything else. And you really don't want to end a book when you're writing it crying. And it always surprises me when I get to the end of a book and things happen that I didn't want to happen, I didn't expect were going to happen, and that I'm as surprised as my reader. And that happens more often than you can imagine. You think that an author has complete control over the material. It's not true. It's not true at all. You have a certain amount of imagination when it comes to your characters, and then they take over. Their voice speaks in your head, tells you what they think, tell you what they're planning to do, and all you have to do is, it's like taking dictation. You just type away, you take it all down, and whatever they're saying, and sometimes I say things as, oh, I can't, do you really want to say that? And it's like, yes, I do. And then you have no choice. You just have to type it and put it in the book, and that's it. And sometimes, they do things that totally ruin all of the things you want to do in this book. I had this problem with Sota, because Sota is a story about a woman who has, it's not exactly an adulterous affair, but it's a relationship with somebody outside of marriage. And it was a story that I read in a newspaper, and about a married woman who has an affair with a ultra-Orthodox married man. And I thought to myself, what would she what would induce a religious married woman to do such a thing? And I thought to myself, well, the husband must have been a loser. He must have been really horrible and boring and terrible. And then you can make your reader sympathetic to this woman who looks for love elsewhere. And in my book, the character of Judah, who was her husband, just refused to cooperate. He was wonderful. He was kind. He was giving. He was the nicest, most wonderful person you could imagine, which left me in a real pickle, because now how am I going to explain this woman and keep my readers sympathetic to her? So you have to go with that. I had to go with that. I couldn't change that. That was who he was, and I was going to have to figure it out. And if you read Sota, you'll see what I did with it. So that's my answer to your question.
Julie's asking, when you base your novels on a true story, do you need permission to write your version of the true story from the people?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Do you need permission to write your version of a story that's based on a true story?
Well, it depends how much you're going to take from the true story. It depends how much you're going to identify. There are so many books out there that are very loosely fictionalized. They're truth stories. Everybody knows that they're a truth story, and they just change the names basically. And you can do that. But I personally, because I know these people, would never do that. I had a long talk with the person that it happened to, and before I attempted to think about writing this book, and had complete approval to do it. But I decided in the end that I was going to change the characters completely. I was going to switch the sexes of the characters. I was going to give them totally different backgrounds. I was going to change everything completely, because it wouldn't give me enough freedom if I was basing it on a true story to use my imagination. So, that's a sword that cuts both ways. I mean, on one hand, you have the material, but on the other hand, you're limited, because, you have to worry about what they'll think and what their families will think, and whether or not, the story that you're telling is true to life. No, just fictionalize it, and do a good job fictionalizing it, and just basically use the idea of being together with your enemy and figuring something out together about love and forgiveness, and whether or not that's possible. I don't know if that's possible. Not with the Holocaust. I honestly don't know if it's possible to forgive and to move forward. So I honestly don't know what's going to happen in this book. It's not going to be, the ending of this book is not going to be tied at all to what happened in real life. It's going to be fiction. It's going to be what I think should have happened or could have happened. And that's the way it's going to go.
Okay, going back to the business end of publishing and writing books, Nancy asks, do you get anything for how many people check out your books from libraries?
Well, interestingly enough, in Israel, you do. In Israel, there is an organization that's government run that donates money to paying authors for how many books are checked out of the library. You will never get a penny for your books checked out of the library in America. They don't give authors 2 cents. The only thing you get from books being in the library is that they buy a copy. So they buy a copy, and then 1,000 people read one copy. So when you meet an author, never tell the author that you've checked the book out of the library. Just lie. Just lie. It's perfectly okay, but never say to an author, "Oh, I love your book. I put my name on the waiting list on the library." What a terrible thing to tell an author. So never say that. Just lie. Say, "Oh, I bought a copy of your book. It was great."
Does anyone else have any other questions? You can unmute yourself and jump in if you'd like to. I actually have a question for you, Naomi. What's your reaction to the success of the shows like Shtisel on TV? It seems like the world is starting to have a romance with the ultra-Orthodox world. And did that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me because I'm the one that started this. Because I knew from way back how interesting this world is and how full and how many things there are to explore. So I get tremendous satisfaction from seeing the success of shows like Shtisel, which I think is a great show. I love Shtisel. I watch it. I think he's done an amazing job. And I think anything that brings an outsider closer to a world he's not familiar with increases love in the world. It increases understanding in the world. And that's what we need. That's what we need. And I think it's a good antidote to anti-Semitism. If people can come into Shtisel and see all the people with the funny hats and the side curls and everything that they're so, frightened of and so suspicious of, and they see inside that world that they're just normal people, they're good people, they're bad people, they're living their lives. I think that's a wonderful thing, and I'm all in favor. And I'm very happy that from the beginnings of my one book, that this whole industry has been created, and I think that's fantastic, and I consider it my success. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Susan's asking, do you feel that it's in the same vein, do you feel that your books have had a positive effect? Well, she's asking, do you feel that your books have had a positive effect within your community?
Well, I think so. I'll tell you a story, and then you can tell me what you think. I lost my father-in-law, I don't know, many years ago. And when someone dies in the family in Israel and Jerusalem, you have to go and get a death notice printed up. And at that time, the only place that printed death notices was this little printing place in the middle of ultra-Orthodox Mea Shearim, and nobody in the family could go, so they sent me. So I was a little nervous about this, and I went to this house, and there was a long line of people, all of them ultra-Orthodox, and I sit down by the computer, and this ultra-Orthodox man looks at the computer, and he says, "Okay, what do you want it to say?" So I tell him the name of my father-in-law, which is Ragen, and I tell him my husband's name, and then I tell him my name. And he looks at me, and he says, "Wait a second," he says, "Naomi Ragen, the writer? Did you write that book, Sota?" And I'm thinking, okay, now they're going to tar and feather me and run me out of town. I'm done. And he looks at me and he says, I read that book and I really liked it. It made me understand a lot of things about my wife that I didn't understand before." So that's my answer to you.